Well, good morning and welcome to The Well. If we haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Danny. I am one of the pastors here at our church and just excited and glad that you're here, that you're in worship with us today, especially if it's your first time. I think it takes a lot of courage to come and to try a new church, and so honored and excited that you would come and join us. Now, I want to share a little bit of information that may be like shocking to you, but I've done some hard time. I spent some time in the slammer in my life. You guys didn't laugh at that at all. Made the transition way harder, but I did. So when I was in college, my freshman or sophomore year, maybe you've done this before, like you go to a restaurant and you eat your meal and you realize, if you're being charitable, you would say you don't have enough money to pay for it. If you're being honest, you say you calculated this decision and that you said you were going to leave without paying for your meal. And so I remember I went to this restaurant. The best equivalent would be Courtesy Diner, the Oregon version of this. It was called Sherry's. And I went to it, and I remember like we had kind of talked about it. Have you ever done anything like this in your life? Like you talk a big game, and then you're like, well, we're never going to do this. And so my roommate and my twin brother and I were sitting at this restaurant. And one of us goes away to the bathroom, and the other two of us are left there sitting, and we're like talking or whatever, and we're like, it's been 15 minutes, 30 minutes, like, oh, he did this. Like, he's out of here, right? And so we ended up like trying to do it too. We tried to accomplish this illegal task. Please give me grace, guys. You guys look at me like I'm the only one that's ever sinned in this room, right? So we escape, we go out of here, and we're like driving away. We feel all high and mighty about it. And my roommate, though, he was the only one of us that was 21. And so he felt like it was his job as the only 21-year-old there to order a beer at this diner for breakfast. And so he orders a beer, and we get 15 minutes down the road, and he realizes he left his wallet on the seat, right? He wouldn't have needed that if he wouldn't have got the stupid beer, right? Like, we could have avoided this. So we go back, and we get there, and he goes in first. He's like, I'm going to fall on the sword for you guys. And then my brother and I are like, we can't leave him hanging. And so we go, and there's handcuffs, and there's police reports, and all this stuff. And we show up for our court date. And it was quite an interesting feeling and experience, right? We're standing in front of the judge, and there's people there that are looking at like 5 to 10, people that are looking at like minor charges, people that are looking at like bigger things, and they're going up, and there are these different charges. And then we go up, and the judge like looks at our thing on the docket, and he's like, Danny Liebarger, it looks here like it says dine and dashing, and everyone laughs like at me, like all these people in this room laugh. And I'm like, man, like I am the lowest of the low in this room. Like everyone else is in here looking at like considerable time, some of these people. And then this person's like, this guy, he wouldn't even pay for his $37 like cheesy fries, right? Like it was a terrible experience for me. And so the judge gets up and he's talking, and ended up not having to like do any time. Though I did get a mug shot, and I had to do some of those things, fingerprints, all that kind of stuff. Didn't have to do any time. But the judge is going through all these things, and he kind of ends it with like do better was essentially what he ended. He's like, and I know that like my experience, like there are people that have done more time for far less, and so I experienced a high level of privilege in this situation that I was able to come into this. But the judge looks at me and he says to me, he says, next time, do better, right? And I felt this like huge shame and like guilt and fear slip away, because I was expecting like I'm gonna do time, I'm gonna have to pay money I don't have, I'm gonna have to do all the, like I had worst case scenario in that. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like that. I hope that you haven't legally had to be in a situation like that, but maybe with someone else when you're in trouble. It's quite an interesting and liberating feeling when the person in front of you that has every reason to condemn you, to judge you, to sentence you, says, do better. Like, and it was, like, maybe you had that experience like a parent that like, do better, like that, or like, I'm not mad at you, I'm disappointed, right? It didn't feel like that actually. That's not what it felt like. It felt quite liberating to me. I'm like, man, I've been given this chance, regardless of what I did, to be able to go and to try to do better the next time. And it was quite an interesting experience. And for many of us, I think there are two sides of this coin, right? Like some of us are the person that is being judged, that have committed the crime. Some of us that have done something wrong or egregious, whether it feels big or little to us, we're that person. And we're reconciling with like do I still have a seat at the table? Like, how are people going to respond to me? Am I allowed to be here? Like, how much grace do I deserve? I know there's many of us in this room that have felt that. Some of us, though, are on the other side, right? Like, we are maybe the one that is specifically casting the judgment. Maybe we're the one that the offense was against. Maybe we're also just someone that feels like it's our job to cast a judgment, and we're standing there and we're saying, like, I think this person should be punished for their action. I think this person should have to pay the consequences, right? And there's two sides of this coin. And what I wanted to do, like, sin and repentance and forgiveness are topics that I think are very, very important to talk about, but sometimes we attempt to avoid them because talking about sin makes us feel uncomfortable. The idea that we could ever do something wrong, like if we just try hard enough or our heart's in the right place, then we can never sin, right? Or like, sin is a real thing. Like, it threatens to tear us apart from God and from one another. We make wrong steps. We're not required to be perfect. Like, sin and brokenness is a part of our existence. But sometimes we get nervous talking about it. Forgiveness, the other side of that, sometimes we get really nervous to talk about forgiveness. Sometimes, maybe you grew up this way, you were told forgiveness meant like accepting that people were going to do bad things to you. Like, growing up in my church, we use the language of like Jesus turning the other cheek. And I love that. I think it's a really interesting and great story, but at least in my context, it was kind of used to condemn or rather perpetuate like further levels of abuse. So it was like, if you've been hurt in this way, if you've been wronged, like, don't call them out. Don't do, like, just turn, like, it might keep happening to you, but the best way to be like Jesus is to just allow this to keep happening. I know that's not what Jesus would have meant, at least I would imagine that's not what Jesus would have meant, but that's how it was used in my upbringing. And so what I want to do for us is to talk about this, I think, difficult topic of sin and brokenness, forgiveness, repentance. How do we turn into that? How do we do this in a way that honors ourselves? Maybe if we are the one that is in that moment, how do we honor those that are maybe on the other side of it? If we're the judger, how do we honor people if we're on the outside of that? If we're a bystander watching, and ultimately, how does Jesus interact with us in this? So with that in mind, I've decided to try something new. So last week I tried this for the first time, but if you go into the app, you can pull up sermon notes. In there, there's some fillable notes. You can actually see my entire preaching outline for where we're going. I tell you that because there won't be sermon slides, but that's the easy way for you to go and to see what's in there and see where we're going. And there's some ways for you to take notes, to write things down, to fill out things, so you can still engage and interact. You can also email them to yourself if you want. And so if you don't have the Well 636 app, you can look at that Well 636 app in the Apple or Android store, pull it up if you have it, and if you want to take notes on paper, you can do that as well. But you'll be able to see kind of where we're going here today. But there's this story in the Gospel of John that details this woman kind of caught in the act of sinning, caught in the act of adultery. And there's a story that's really quite famous in regards to Jesus' interaction with those that have been caught in sin. But it also tells an interesting story of how religious people often respond to sin and brokenness. So if you want to follow along with me, whether in the app or if you want to open up your Bibles, we're going to be in John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. So you can follow along with me as I read this. It says, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him. He sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery, and the law of Moses commanded us to stone this woman. Now, what do you say?" I'll stop there really quick. Like, this is a really interesting thing. So Jesus comes into the temple to teach, right? He's coming in, he wants to teach, he wants to do this thing. And if you listen to that line, it's pretty easy to overlook, but it says he goes in, he wants to teach him, and it says the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought this woman in the act of caught in the act of adultery. They wanted to see how Jesus would judge her. So Jesus comes in, like, he's not even interested at this point in teaching on this. Like, he's coming in just to teach what it means to follow God and be a part of this way of Jesus, this new thing that he's starting. And then the legal people, the religious people, are like, hey, we found this person that messed up, right? We found this person that sinned, and by all accounts, by our laws and our rules, she is condemnable to death. And so they bring her in, and they put her on show in front of everyone. Again, that's important because I think we read over this and like, well, this was this mutual agreed upon moment. Like Jesus is trying to teach good news to the oppressed and to all the people we talked about last week. And then the religious people find someone that is that person, the oppressed, the person who needs Jesus, the person that is striving for this. They grab her and then they put her front and center like she's someone that needs to be like gawked at and mocked, kind of like she's on trial here in front of everyone. They bring her and they put her in the middle. They say, the law of Moses says that she should be stoned. And then they say to Jesus, well, what do you say we should do? Like the law says this is an impossible situation. And Jesus gets put in these a lot. It's like, if you say don't do the law, then he's going against like what religious people, his way. Jesus wasn't a Christian, just like Jesus was a Jewish person. So he follows the Jewish law, right? And so they're like, are you going to say that he has to break all these laws? Like these don't matter anymore, right? So what do you say we should do? Jesus. They were using this question to trap him in order to have a basis of accusing him. But Jesus, he bent down and started to write in the ground with his finger. When they kept questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Again, he stooped down and he wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She replies, no one, sir. And then Jesus says, neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin. Other translations say, go and sin no more. So this is really, like, there's a lot that goes on in this story, right? There's some words said, but there's a lot of things that are unsaid. Like, scholars for generations have been trying to figure out, like, what was Jesus writing in the sand? Like, I mean, that's an interesting thing. Like, imagine, like, you guys came into church and someone asked me a question. I just started, like, writing with a crayon on the ground. You feel like, and then none of you can see it. You're in the back, like, what is he doing? And then I stand up and I just start talking. Like, that would be a weird, jarring feeling. Some scholars think that he's writing down the names of the men that she has been with, some of which are in the crowd. Some think that he's writing down other sins that these Pharisees and legal experts have committed that would have broken the Levitical law, that would have had them condemnable to death, and he's trying to point out to them that there's this equal standing, that it's actually like you guys are presenting yourself as quite holy and pious and righteous, but on paper or on sand, as he writes it down, like we've all sinned, we've all messed up here, we've all fallen short. But regardless of what he's writing in the sand, it's quite convicting to them. And again, things that are really easy to like skip over, it says that they leave one by one, starting with the oldest, ending with the youngest, Pharisees. You know, I remember talking to someone early on in my ministry, and I was like, I don't really know why that would have happened. Like, why would the older ones leave first? Like, maybe they're the most established, they have the most to say. Like, wouldn't they be the ones staying there to fight the battle the longest, right? They're the ones that have the most to accuse her with. And this pastor, a friend of mine, was saying, well, at least the way I interpret it is the reason that the older ones left the fastest is they saw the error of their ways almost immediately. They saw that they had set up an impossible situation for Jesus, for this woman, and for themselves, that if they were going to hold her to this standard of accountability, that they were just as accountable to the judgment they were asking for. So they saw this error and they walked away. But what's interesting is like the new pastors, the new Pharisees, the new younger legal experts, they were pretty like excited and passionate about this new religion that they were getting a part to lead. And the rules were very important to them. And they stayed longer trying to fight this fight as long as they possibly could. Like they were the ones that were trying to condemn her because they had this energy and excitement that they, even if they didn't have the knowledge to back up, they had this energy and excitement that they tried to condemn her with. But all of that kind of skipped to the side. There's this really interesting set of things that Jesus says to her. He says two different things here. He says, neither do I condemn you, right? So he says, woman, where are your accusers? And no one is there left, right? Like no one, she's probably like, if I was her in this, I'd be like tear-soaked eyes. Like I wouldn't even be able to see people in front of me. Like the shame and the guilt, the pain of like stirring all of this up in my life and then having to do it in the middle of all these people, especially religious people that I've been told are supposed to be the ones that are helping me get closer to God. They're ultimately making me feel the greatest level of shame that I can and telling me that because of my actions that my access to God is gone and the only option I have is death. like tears would be in my eyes. Like I wouldn't be able to see anyone in front of me. And Jesus says, like, where are they? And she looks around and she sees no one. And he says back to her, neither do I condemn you. And when I think about like our role as Christians, again, there's two sides of this. Some of us feel like we ought to be condemned, and some of us feel like we ought to condemn other people, right? And so talking to those that feel like they maybe should be condemned, maybe you've done something that like feels like you've stepped too far out of bounds, maybe you've done something that feels like you're irredeemable, unlovable, you feel like you've done something that is above a dine and dash, something that like just would really minimize how not bad that was in my life. No, I'm just kidding, guys. You can laugh with me, guys. You can laugh with me. Maybe you feel like there's a condemnation that's on you that makes you feel quite uncomfortable. Jesus, I would argue, would be standing next to you in the exact same way he was standing next to this woman. Like the act that she was caught in was not consequential to this story. This could have been the person caught in thievery, the person caught in adultery, the person caught in lying, the person caught in anything that would have been outside of the 615 laws that the Jewish people were following. So that part is not consequential to the story and the thrust of where it's going. The most important part of this story is the response Jesus gives, which is, neither do I condemn you. And I say that to you to say, like, regardless of where you are, like maybe you've come into this place and you're really wondering, like Anne-Marie said this at the beginning, like our mantra is your seat at the table can't cost someone else theirs. You might be in here and say, like, I've been hearing this for weeks. Maybe it's your first time I've been hearing this for one day, right? And I'm not actually sure that in practice that's true. Like I've lost my seat. I hurt this person. I've pushed this person away. I've judged this person. I've broken this commandment. Like, is my seat really here? And there are two things happening in this neither do I condemn you, right? Jesus is making it clear that though people are attempting to condemn her, no one has a basis to. Like that's important to understand. And so when we feel condemned, it's important to understand that like as painful as it is, it feels like daggers, right? It feels like daggers when people condemn us and judge us. But Jesus is trying to make a point that like their condemnation does not have any implication on your significance and value as a person. Like other people's condemnation feels heavy. It feels painful, it hurts, it often makes us feel isolated from friends and other people. But Jesus is trying to make a clear point that their assessment of how well you're doing, their assessment of your standing with God is not the most important evaluation. And on the other side, Jesus is making a clear point that his evaluation, which does matter, comes with no condemnation and no judgment for a sin in their time that was ultimately punishable by death. And so I'm interested to think more about that. Because I don't know like if you grew up in a situation where you were told that or you believe that, or maybe you currently don't believe that. And when you think about your sin and your brokenness and the areas that you've messed up and the condemnation that comes from God, other people, the church, whoever, like I wonder, because I imagine some of us feel it quite heavily. Maybe some of us have never felt it at all. But I imagine that for the majority of us, it's felt quite heavy. And Jesus is trying to illustrate to his audience that there is no condemnation in him. And though there is verbal condemnation from others, that is the least important rubric to try to measure yourself by. But Jesus then continues, and this is the part that like some people maybe miss. Like Jesus does give her a challenge. Go and sin no more, right? He doesn't say like, maybe you should keep committing adultery. Like he doesn't say that. He doesn't say like, I co-sign this act. But what he does say is like, go and sin no more. And what I find to be quite interesting about this, and I've said this in other stories, like you've probably heard me say this, you've been around, there's a story of the Pharisee and the tax collector, they leave, Jesus never follows up with him. We get no follow-up with Jesus in this story. Jesus says, he gives a commandment, like go and sin no more, as this translation says it, go now and leave your life of sin. But we don't see Jesus like sending her like monthly pen pal letters saying like, hey, how you doing this week? Like, did you have an accountability friend like ever? Like a Christian accountability friend that would like call you and be like, hey, how many times are you reading your Bible this week? Or, hey, how many times did you sin this week? And I was like, well, I went to Sherry's a couple times, so it didn't go super well. The restaurant, not a person, sorry. So there's this level of like fear, I think, in our minds that someone will eventually like catch us, right? They're gonna call us out. They're gonna find us to be frauds because we're not keeping this rubric that happens. But Jesus does give an imperative. He says, go and sin no more. But the reality is like a relationship lived in union with Jesus wasn't one that was predicated on how well we did. And I can't like express that enough. Like it wasn't a acts-based thing. Like Paul talks about this in the book of Romans, that we are justified by grace and faith alone and not by our works, right? Like we oftentimes imagine that our works and our ability to color with inside the lines of either what church has told us or our religious people have told us, that is what makes us a follower of Jesus. And Jesus says, like, I want you to go and I want you to abandon this life that is ultimately not helping you live into the person I created you to be. But also I know that that's going to be a hard challenge for you to do. That's not going to be something that you can do every second of every day, but it's going to be something that I'm always challenging you to do. But ultimately the grace that is offered and the faith that is found is what fuels your relationship with me, not some work or perfection or rubric of getting it all right. Usually though, if you come to the well, if you're new, you would not have done this before, but usually we do questions at the beginning of service. But I wanted to like populate our minds with some thoughts before I did this. And so usually one of the things we sometimes do is we'll have conversation with those that are around us. And what I would challenge you to do is if there's someone around you don't know, I've watched people come into this space and make friendships through moments like this, small groups formed and things like that. I've also watched people sometimes feel isolated, like I don't know anyone around me. So if you see someone around you, like don't be like me level extrovert where you like bring them into something that they don't want to be a part of, but maybe like introduce yourself and be like, hey, would you like to be a part of our conversation? But here's what I would like you to do really quick. If you would turn and introduce yourself to the people around you, and I want you to talk about, like when you think about, and this is a little bit of an amorphous question, but when you think about God's view of sin as it relates to your connection to Jesus. So the sin in your life, we'll use this adulterous woman, for example. Like for her, she was told by the religious people that her sin was the ultimate roadblock from her having a relationship with Jesus. She could have gone to temple 3 times a week. She could have read the Torah every day, even though culture probably wouldn't have allowed her to. She could have been able to do all these different things that would have allowed her to be a really, really righteous person, but ultimately her actions excluded her. And so if you would take a little bit of time in your group, and I want you to talk about like, how much have you been told or believed that faith is the important part, like the connection, the relationship, and how much have you been told that works are the important part of your relationship with Jesus? And have whatever version of robust conversation you want around that. We'll do about 60 seconds to 120 seconds, so take a little bit of time.